The grassroots. All right. So it starts from the bottom up. The pelvis. It's from the pelvis. So think about it. And then what's your experience tell you? What starts a movement? And then my brain went into bowel movement, blah, blah, blah. They're all movements. They're all movements. It's hard to think of a movement, a behaviour that doesn't have some kind of movement attached to it. Death. The ultimate behaviour. Yes, the cessation of movement. A thought. Okay, I can, because they're sort of rapid fire responses, I can repeat them for the tape unless they're a long response. So there's a thought.
That one's a bit awkward because if it's an animal in flight. If a human or animal, I presume, in flight, they might move and react before they actually think.
Yeah, so there could be an automatic. Yep, there could be an automatic movement. So what would come before a thought? What would bring up that? Is there anything that bring up a thought? Narayan, and then a reflex. Yeah. So I'll put reflex down here because something triggers a reflex. Even a reflex is triggered by something. Now there is no complete right answer to this because actually a thought can generate a movement, absolutely. So I'm putting it up there, and there's another way that a movement can be generated. So something can happen prior to a thought.
I was just doing a bit of that body Mandela reading in the break. And I was thinking if it's a response to something, so maybe it's a sensation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So there are, and I'll put the thought up here and I'll take it out of apology brackets because it's true. We can have a think and not have a precursing sensation. And we can have a sensation that then leads to the think that we need to move. Can you think of examples?
Your one about bowel.
The bowel is a sensation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So about thinking I've got to go to the toilet, I get a sensation, and then I act. I behave accordingly. Or it might be as obscure as one of our mutual colleagues sent some little cartoons around where one of the definitions of old age is that if you pass a toilet, you go in just in case. So it's so therefore it's not even, I don't even get a somatic response. I see it. So it's a visual stimulus. Toilet, I'd better make use of that because you never know when the next toilet's coming up. So it can be a visual stimulus that then leads to the thought, which is more complicated. I'd better just in case. So that kind of future planning.
So, which is what I was going to say. So in terms of those three different, the three paradigms we had looking at the lesson. So you've got the environmental stimulus, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And then you have thought and you have sensation.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So pervasively, there is an environment that can lead to a sensation, that can lead to a thought. Can you think of an example where it's just a thought and there's no sensation to move?
Yeah.
What drives that thought that I'd like to sit down? So I'm going to be really pedantic and say that you're sitting down in response to hearing something. There's a stimulus. There's an environmental stimulus that makes you want to sit down. I'm not being cute about this. I really struggle to think about a behaviour that comes from a pure thought. So this is a game where I don't have an answer, and I'm not saying that there isn't an answer, because sometimes people have come up with an answer. I can just never remember them. But so it's sort of, isn't it interesting? So because there's a way that the brain is wired up, that we plan movements that are thought-based, not sensory triggered.
So, but that goes back to that philosophical thought, mind-body split.
Yeah.
Is where people, there was that I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Is actually redundant in many words, because they were saying that unless you could label something, you couldn't know something. And so therefore, if language is dominating how we think, then sensation is actually secondary to thought. So that's why I said thought.
Right.
But because in actual fact, it's possibly sensation and environment that generates thought through the body.
First.
So we can't just dismiss it.
Yeah.
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 I'm thinking of babies.
Pardon? A baby?
Yeah, a baby.
What behaviour could a baby do that doesn't arise from a sensation? Yeah, this is a genuine question about, can we think of a behaviour that we can't argue has some sensory stimulus, either internally derived, like my bowels are full, I've got to empty them, which is internal. It's not an environmental thing. That's an internal environment, versus something from the external. Because theoretically, it's possible. The brain can do it. We'll just go the hands first, and then.
Susan, what about all those occasions that you want to try and be careful about in an ATM, where you give a person a thought that then changes perhaps the direction of a so you're breathing away, and your ATM instructor says, "Are you breathing?" And then you deliberately alter. You start breathing out, or you breathe heavily, or you breathe lightly, that's my example. That's close to think, alter.
However, there's something before the think. There's an auditory stimulus.
Yeah. But if you were, I guess I was originally thinking of, you might be meditating, and you might be, so you're mostly quite closed down, and you're of course trying not to think. Well, not really, but and you do try to focus back on your breathing, and that is a thought, to focus on your breathing.
Yeah, that could be it. Should we probe that? So if you are, if a spontaneous thought arises, I want to pay attention to my breathing. So that just purely arises out of awareness and not out of a sensation. That's a possibility. Can we probe that? Does that hold? Is that a possibility? So we can have a spontaneously arising thought that will lead to an action. Just so they want you to do the box. I was hoping to avoid the box, but we can never avoid the box.
It's probably being pedantic as well, but if you suddenly start to pay attention to your breathing, there's a pre-sensation of what it was, so you know what to change it to. So you think there might be something subconscious, a subconscious sensation about breathing that brings that thought about paying attention to the breathing. Yeah. Which comes back to the other idea.
You're just playing with us, because
I don't mean to be. This is a genuine question.
No, I understand. It's a genuine question. But if you're looking at whether or not conscious and unconscious sensation is identifiable because of what we think. So do you actually know, can you identify your sensations if you can't name them? Yeah, it's a good question. Because if we are talking, sorry, I'm just going on a bit of a rant. If you don't know something, if you can't feel something, we don't know it because we can't feel it, because we can't identify the sensation. Yeah. So if you then say, someone like Alison says, think about your breathing. It may be the first time you actually noticed your breathing because somebody's giving you something, a pointer to think about. So the thinking is actually changing the sensation.
Yeah. So now we need to refine the question a little bit, because thinking denotes being conscious of something.
Well, even if you're unconscious, the conscious thinking changes the unconscious
Yes.
thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And can you think without sensation?
Oh, yeah. Ooh,
No, I would argue.
So let me go through. I asked this question of a client of mine who has very poor sensation, like globally. I call him the ultimate quad because he had a bilateral brainstem stroke. So it means he's paralysed from the neck down. So he really doesn't have a body that moves. And I asked him if he still felt, so it was a few different questions. He can sense a bit, quite a bit, but he can't move. So he can't sense movement. He can sense tactile a bit. It's not clear, but absolutely he can still think. And one of my weirdo colleagues, and retired neuroscientist from Flinders, did a total body anesthesia experiment on himself because he couldn't get ethics to do it on anybody else, and he could still think. Yeah.
Yeah, but the process of thinking means creating images and sounds and sensations in your brain.
Yeah. So could you think if you'd never sensed? It's probably, nobody knows. I don't think anybody knows because we don't know anybody who's never sensed. Certainly,
Limitations of science.
this guy didn't, I don't think he wrote up his weirdo session, but anyway. So there's a couple of things to highlight, and I'd like, you can go away and ponder this question, because I often ponder this question, and I can think myself around in circles. So it's not like I've got an answer here sitting up smug waiting for you to guess what it is, because that's a ridiculous teaching strategy, and I'd encourage you not to do it. Guess what the teacher's thinking, it's called. So you can't guess what I'm thinking, because I'm genuinely puzzled by this question. However, Philip has raised a couple of points, that there is this whole debate about knowing and awareness, and this whole debate about the subconscious knowing and the subconscious sensing. And there's no doubt that we can move a lot quite subconsciously. So so all of your wriggling, for example, is very subconscious. You're not having an aware, conscious thought. Hi, Nina. You're not having an aware, conscious thought about wriggling. Your deep pressure sensors in your butt are just actually having a conversation with the subconscious part of your brain saying, get off me, I'm feeling really uncomfortable. And so you wriggle, you do that. Whereas somebody who's paralysed, like a paraplegic, who's there's no communication between their butt and their brain, they don't wriggle. They don't, because they don't even feel it subconsciously or consciously. So it is a lot more complicated than what we're going to talk about today, because of this thing that we, with the subconscious, we don't necessarily know, because we don't know what's subconscious. All we know is that a lot more, the subconscious is the consciousness is a real iceberg, where consciousness is a little tiny tip up the top, and the subconscious is huge, much bigger than we think, literally. Yeah, Philippa. Yeah, you say no. You've got to say it. Otherwise you'll burst. I can see it.
Well, it's one of those things I've been thinking about in the reading. Remember the bit about the cat, the kittens that were carried, and even though they were not blind, and they could see everything, because they had no interaction with the environment, but only they did not know how to do anything. No, they couldn't see. They couldn't see because they'd been carried. And so when they were put back, even though they weren't, yeah, that's right, they couldn't see, but they weren't really blind.
Right. Yep.
They were functionally blind.
Uh-huh. So which article is this one? Here's another one that I haven't read.
This was the one about
the Dreyfus one?
The body schema.
Okay.
Yes. So.
Yeah. So there is something about, and it's it's a related area. There is something about the fact that we need to move in order to sense better.
Yes. So then it made me think about, if we only stick our kids in front of screens,
Yes.
do they actually understand? Can they actually see the real world?
And the answer is probably not, because my evidence for this is experiential. Well, it's anecdotal actually. It's not my experience. Some of my colleagues work with children who unfortunately have been brought up in impoverished environments, which is what that scenario could be. And it's an apparent, this is not uncommon for them to find. So it's an intellectually disabled services council, is what it used to be called. So they're often working with parents who have an intellectual disability, who have children. And the children, if you test them, actually can look quite disabled, but there's actually nothing neurologically wrong with them. But they've been brought up in an environment, unfortunately, and this is not, you don't have to have an intellectual disability to not be a good parent either. But the sad situation is that these parents don't know about environmental stimulation. It's just one of these scenarios that we have to think about as a society. And I remember the first time this happened to my colleague, she took these little kids to the zoo and they couldn't see properly because they didn't have distance vision. And in particular, so when they went to the zoo, they couldn't see animals far away. So they obviously had to practice distance vision. And there wasn't actually anything neurologically wrong with these children. It's just that they hadn't had the opportunity to do that, and then that, and then that, and then that. And then the really hard thing was that even if the animal was quite close up and there was a fence between it, like a chain wire fence, they didn't know how to look through the wire fence to see through it. So what we do is we focus through and we see the animal on the other side and we blur the links. And these kids couldn't do it.
So they just saw
So they saw the fence and then nothing beyond it. It was like the fence was solid. They couldn't shift focus. So yes, it happens. This opportunity to practice perceiving is actually what it is, requires engagement with the environment. So this thing that I've put here is a very simple arrow, is not in any way a simple arrow. And I think I mentioned this last week, that this having the opportunity to interact with the environment shapes us. And it's part of the developmental process. And so children of any species who are denied access to a full richness of the environment are also developmentally impoverished. And I think I said last week why this is important is if you think about, so the way I was taught about neurodevelopment was that it was what's called inexorable. It happened. We just, our nervous systems matured no matter what. They inherently matured. When this started to be realised that the environment makes a difference, it then became it's a human right for children to be exposed to environmental stimuli, because if they don't develop. And it's not in policy in Australia, but it's in policy in the States. So you can be charged with that. Yeah. Yes, I mean, obviously you can be charged with neglect and abuse here, but it's often seen as more, malnutrition and physical. Whereas in the States, there is a policy about children having the right to be in an enriched environment. So that's how important it is. So your points are that important. They are so important that they're a fundamental human right. There should be a species right. So we cannot discount this. The exposures that we have in the environment that we sense. We think it's like the sense just picks this up, but no, this shapes us. And then, of course, we can shape the environment. And obviously we're doing a pretty fucking awful job of that, shaping the environment, aren't we? I.e. managing to ruin it. But it's another political movement, isn't it? So there's this interaction all the time. And so our nervous system develops in response to the environment, and then it gets better. So maybe I'll bring some slides about, I've got some just, sort of this ability to perceive, which is to make sense of the senses, is shaped by the environment. I think I've said it a million times. but you get the idea because it's really important. Really, really important. So it's really, really important for us as Feldenkrais practitioners, because it means that, because what we do in an ATM is we kind of limit the environment to a very controlled way by lying on the floor and minimizing gravity. So gravity is a part of the environment that we learn to perceive better and worse, in better or worse ways, I should say. So we control and kind of strip the environment down to quite simple things so that we can pay attention to them. So when you finish an ATM lesson, or when you finish an FI lesson, and watching Ruth very, very beautifully getting, if you don't mind me commenting on with Kevin's lesson then, closing his environment down to the table and his internal sensations, and then a little bit of external. And then she took her time and allowed Kevin to take his time to open his perceptions out, even to this environment. And then the next thing would be to open it to a bigger environment, outdoors and so forth and so on. Does that make sense? So in Feldenkrais, we do manipulate the environment, absolutely, explicitly, in order for people to have it simplified, and they can practice perceiving just a few things. And we close our eyes even more so to shut out the visual impact of the environment, so that we can privilege in the somatic sensations. So we can give them primacy, because normally our vision, for most people, vision has primacy. Depends on the nature of the task and blah, blah, blah. But that's that. So we've got this. So it's hard, let's just leave it that it's hard to think about a movement that arises from a thought that doesn't have some kind of sensory stimulus. I think we can all agree it's possible. Certainly neurologically it's possible. It's just hard to imagine what it is. And it's a constant quest for me to try and think about it. I mean, the meditation one, yes, who knows what's bubbling up subconsciously, that we don't know. And that's why there's probably not an answer to this question, but anyway, we'll leave it there. Okay, so we have a sensation. So what happens to that sensation is a couple of things. If it's a really dangerous sensation, let's say, we'll put a skull and crossbones there. It's dangerous. That sensation will kind of be perceived, at the spinal cord level. So I just call that the spinal cord. That's the spinal cord. And here's the brain up there, like that. That's the front of the brain. This is the spinal cord. They're connected. Yeah, and they're connected via the midbrain, which is here. There's a little cauliflower thing here. There's this bulbous part, and then they go down like that. And they're connected. And that's actually a monkey brain because it's not quite big enough. That's better. Okay. So, and this is actually much skinnier. And then it has all these nerves. It's got all these nerves coming off. So anyway, the sensation is picked up somewhere. Now, it could be eyes. It could, I better write it because my drawing is going to fall apart. It could be vision. It could be hearing. It could be tactile. So it's touch. There's a whole lot of things in touch. It could be, so temperature's in the tactile receptors. It's not in, it has its own, but it's in the skin. Yep. And smell, kind of aspects of similar thing. Tactile could be pain. Because I'm just calling them all together because they're all in the skin. Yeah, so now the movement sensors are actually technically vision, tactile, and proprioception, and the vestibular senses. So that's movement. We can sense movement with tactile, we can sense movement with proprioception, and we can sense movement with vestibular. Now, arguably, you can, if a smell goes past you, that tells you that there's movement because you're tracking that it's changing. But it's not if you're walking past and the smell of coffee's there and you walk past it, the fact that the coffee smell changes direction tells you that you're moving. So you could argue that any sense tells you that you're moving, but these are the sort of classic ones. And the same with hearing. So they're the main ones, but there's more. But let's just say they're the main ones because they've all got obvious receptors. By receptor, I mean a receptor is, we've talked about receptors before. So the eyeball is the receptor. It picks up the light rays. It sends it via some little nerves all the way through, and then this part of the brain sorts it out. Recognises all different aspects of it, like light and direction and colour and tonality, and then it starts recognising shape, and then it starts recognising distance and all the different things that we sense with our eyes. What we don't sense with our eyes, our brain perceives from the stimulus, right? And then it goes to language centres and we recognise it and name it, label it, and then it's that. So there is quite a big chunk of the brain that's computing all this stuff that's not in language. Big chunks that's not in language. Do we know it before it gets to language? It's yes and no. Anyway, that might be another conversation. Okay, so we've got all these sensations that can all trigger movement. Now, getting back to here, if it's a dangerous thing, like particularly if we pick it up with so the other thing with tactile is pressure. If we pick up something that's seemingly dangerous, so it's really hot or it's damaging like a pin, and it's either triggering our nociceptors, our pain ones or our pressure ones, it will actually act here. It will get perceived in a way. It's not technically correct, but it will get recognized. Well, recognized, not the same word. It will be enacted upon at the spinal level. If you step on a pin, your foot will withdraw and you won't know anything about it. And you go, oh, well after the fact, you'll go, bloody pin, who left that around here? You'll recognise it, name it, and have something happen. But actually the pin will make you withdraw without conscious thought. Yeah? You're frowning.
No, interesting. So you're saying that movement will get initiated at the spinal level,
at the spinal level,
it's even reached our brains.
Now the clear one that is initiated that goes to the spinal level is if I test your reflex. So if I get you to do this, I can't test it on myself because I'll just stop it. Oh, there you go, I can do it. So if I hit this tendon, that was a real reflex. What it does is stretches a muscle spindle in my quads muscle, and that goes, and it's a single synapse. It goes back. It goes from this muscle spindle, a 1A afferent goes back to here, synapses here, comes back to the muscle and fires off. And that's all just through there. So that is the simplest level of movement behaviour. And it's this. That's very simple. However, it can be influenced by above. So if I chopped off here, it couldn't be. And there's lots of experiments we had to do when I was an undergrad actually with cane toads. Like pith them. You pith them until you stick a knife in here. Sorry. Cane toads, do you care? A little bit? You care? Don't care. He's from Queensland. Don't care. Anyway, that's what we did. And then we would test these reflexes and see what was purely spinal and what stopped happening because it had supraspinal, above spinal influences. So we all know that we can make those reflexes more by doing this. I'm doing this. Clenching everything. That will make this reflex bigger. We could do an experiment if I had my tendon hammer, but I don't, so we won't. So that's a manoeuvre where I increase all the tone, I upregulate all my nervous system, and my reflex would be brisker because it's more upregulated, like that. So we can do that, but that's a whole thing. So we can. That's a That's a supraspinal influence, if you like, because I volitionally go, oh, I'm going to be really hyper. And in fact, if you're having your reflexes tested and they're not sure and they're not getting a reflex, they'll get you to do that. Grit your teeth and do that. And then it makes all your tone goes up and so that's that. Or I can go, bugger you, you're going to hit me with a tendon hammer. I'm going to chill out and go really relaxed, and you won't get the reflex either. So you can increase it and decrease it by this if you want to. Nobody's ever done that? Then they usually have really brisk reflexes. But they can still inhibit it. They just hold themselves even stiffer so that the leg doesn't jump. So we can influence this. And with the pin, if we decide that we like standing on a pin, we can inhibit that.
Susan,
Sorry,
can I ask about gut reflexes? So the idea that we've got some sensors. So, you've talked about there's something that only goes as far as the spinal column.
Yep.
Are there also some that now we know about that are like the experience of disgust? Is that one, I think, that is supposed to be in the gut? So it can go in.
Yep.
So I don't really understand. So I guess I'm asking you: are there some that something happens, you get a response or a movement before your brain's involved, but in fact it's not the spinal column; it's some of the receptors in your gut?
Yeah. So we've talked about these receptors. There's an overlay, if you like, or another kind of part of the nervous system. So I'll just put it in red, which has also got its nerves coming out. And it's involved with, that's the gut. There's lots of squirrely bits and lungs and the heart and all the other things. And that's the autonomic nervous system. And so those sorts of, and there is a whole heap of receptors in all of these as well. So, because there's muscle, but it's smooth muscle, it's not voluntary muscle. So in this black system, we've got receptors, these muscle spindles in skeletal muscle. In these systems, there's still muscle, and they still have receptors, but it's called smooth muscle. But it will also tell us, so the feeling of full. It's not just the gut muscles on the outside stretching, but that feeling of weight is from smooth muscle. But it takes a long time to get back because it's a much slower system. So, but it's not always slow because we can very quickly shut all this down if we're anxious. Or not shut it down, we actually ramp it up. Or if we're feeling very chilled out, we can shut it down and we can go vegetative. So it can respond really quickly. But why it's interesting the difference between the black and the red, they are so connected. They're so intimately connected. So you're kind of taught that they're two separate systems. But in a way, it's that erroneous way of thinking that they're actually so well integrated. But the receptors and the nerve connections with the gut, people say, oh, we've got, as many neurons in what's that thing? There's some Women's Weekly sort of thing we've got. Our gut nervous system is as big as our brain. It's not true, and it's not conscious. But it does connect up. These things are connected. So it's not like we think with our gut, but we certainly sense with our gut, and we certainly interpret experience in our autonomic nervous system. So a lot of our emotions we actually experience as sensations in our autonomic, in our organs. We do. We actually, we fear. Where do you feel fear? Often in your gut. So it's an expression of we interpret those autonomic changes that happen in a certain emotional state. We now associate, and that's how we recognize the emotional state, because it's actually being enacted in our gut. So they're very connected, aren't they? Does that make sense?
Do certain emotions affect your autonomic system and the other one?
Oh, everything. Yeah.
Everything responds.
Yeah. 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 You can't Can you really separate them? Again, it's a bit one of those questions where, get a bottle of red and sit around the fire and say, can you think of a situation where it's all autonomic or not? And you can differentiate them. And that's in a way what we're doing in ATM when we ask you to notice what you're feeling, because then you can isolate it from the actual somatic experience of it. Did I tell you about this weird experience I had quite a few years ago when I had this hormonal imbalance? Did I tell you? So this is another eye story. But it's just really it was really interesting for me because I could use Feldenkrais kinds of principles to... So I had this adrenal issue. So my adrenal system was going mental for some reason. And it was making my gut really fast. So I lost weight, like I was really thin. And did you see me then, Jen? 2007, 2008. Oh, I looked like I had anorexia and I didn't. It was really weird. And I'd get this feeling it wasn't anxiety at all. It had no anxiety, but it was like, I used to explain it to the endocrinologist. I'd wake up, when I'd get these rushes. When I had a rush, I would feel like a kid anticipating Christmas. It was like that. You all know that feeling? This you kind of forget what you're excited about. Then you go, oh, I'm feeling excited about something. What is it? And then the kid will go, oh yeah, it's Christmas. Well, I would have that, and I'd go, what am I feeling excited about? I'm at the supermarket. Like, this is ridiculous. So there was no thinking related to the sensation, the feeling. So it was a somatic feeling, but there was no congruent thinking. So my system kept on trying to find something that would cognitively make sense about why I was feeling excited. And it felt like being in love, to be honest. So I felt like a bloody duckling imprinting. Fortunately, I knew about it. And then I had a great endocrinologist. We tried all sorts of things, all medications and stuff. But ultimately, he said he's seen it quite a bit before, and it usually sends people crazy because they can't reconcile this somatic feelings of this rush when there's no cognitive thought, reason to support the feeling. And so that mismatch is really crazy. Now, fortunately, because I have all this, then I could work with that and separate, okay, I'm having this feeling. It is just a feeling. It's just a feeling. That's what it is. And I can leave it at that. And I don't have to trip into a whole bunch of thoughts and actions and all this sort of stuff. So he said what happens often when people have this is they become really impulsive and they get really excited, so they do impulsive things like go and buy sports cars or that they can't afford or do all this sort of stuff. And I just bought a new lounge and I went, oh, I've just bought a new lounge. And he said, yeah, not really up there. Try a little bit more mad. So people try and match an experience to what they're feeling inside. Isn't that fascinating?
Linda.
It was a mental health first aid course and people were explaining bipolar.
Yeah.
And they were saying, this is how it affects me. I am scared of heights, but when I have a high, I went skydiving.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I just was so hyper.
Yeah. So interestingly, when the endocrinologist and I were talking, his first diagnosis is hypomania, which is one end of bipolar. And that was pretty confronting for me to be told, look, the first diagnosis is a psychiatric condition. And I went, ooh, I don't think I like that. Judgment, judgment, judgment. Went home, talked to everybody, rang up my friends. I went, Susan, they all went, Susan, you are a bit manic. Like, get over it. Like, tell him that's, I am a bit like that. But the fact that I could sit and talk about it, then he discarded that diagnosis. But it's absolutely it's the same sort of thing. Yeah. And so when and those of you who have, sort of skirted around the issues of that kind of mania versus the depressive side in bipolar, it is that this kind of the thinking that goes with the sensation. I don't know.
But in the same way that you could control your behaviour as a result of that stimulus, it could be the same way that someone who suffers anxiety or depression that maybe is that chemical cause of it, could perhaps isolate the feeling from then all the thoughts.
Yeah.
But it's a battle, I presume. It's a battle. You have to actually be all the time going, stop, that's only this.
Yeah, it is a challenge, but it's possible. Now, see, because I could separate them, maybe that means that it wasn't as profound as, say, someone who truly has hypomania, whatever that comes from, or bipolar or whatever. However, when we ask you to check into your feelings, in a way, that's what we're asking you to do, is look at them kind of objectively. And then don't go into this sort of story cycle, the spin cycle of, why am I so excited? I'm in Foodland supermarket. I'm feeling really excited. Does that mean I have to go and buy everything in the shop? No, it doesn't. Or does it, whatever it means. It doesn't mean anything. I'm just having a thing. Yeah. I'm in emotions. Well, in a way, yes. Here's another question, and this could be a very long lecture today or presentation. How do you know you're having an emotion?
Sensations.
Yeah.
I think if you're observing them and with your thoughts, you make distinction.
Yeah. So my current view of a feeling, an emotion, is that it's a thought and a sensation interacting in the body. Isn't it? Because if it's not a thought, it's just a sensation. If the thought's not involved, it's just a sensation. If it's just a thought, there's no sensation, it's just a thought. But the two together, in certain patterns, are recognising turns it into an emotion.
Emma and I talked about this this particular idea about sensation and thought, and what was the communication between those two in terms of what was feeling, because we also discussed it in terms of giving directing an ATM, and how as a facilitator you we're sort of directing towards sensation and thought, so that somehow that communication of emotion is able to separate out.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was part of the discussion.
It's good.
And so it'll be really good if you could elaborate on that, so that Emma and I don't have to talk about that again, something else.
Well, how about we let it land for a bit, just in case that because I want to get back to the movement.
Because it's a complex thing. Because
it is.
When you're lying when you're doing something, often some people are more responsive in terms of how they feel in the emotions. And being able to separate that from the sensation that generates that emotion.
Yeah.
Or the thinking that generates the emotion.
Yeah.
So then as a facilitator, how you actually go about dealing with that when you have someone who has a truly emotional response to finding their right foot.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Okay. I reckon that's such a big thing. I'll go away and think about it. Yeah, and maybe weave it into something tomorrow or the next day.
Yeah, and
because it's big, isn't it?
Yes, because
emotions are big.
Entered the conversation again.
Yeah.
In looking at how you actually dealt with that within the teaching of the ATM, especially in the first January session, which Emma hadn't been part of, because that came up a lot in the very first
one,
that emotional response. So I'm assuming that if you've got a class of new people, that's going to be the first thing that's triggered before the thinking or the sensation is identified.
Possibly for some people, yeah. Depends what they're coming for, you see. If they're coming to thinking that it's like a gym, they won't have an expectation that emotions are going to lurk up. So they'll probably, if it does, they'll fail to recognise it because they're not expecting it. But if you say, come to awareness through movement, where you're going to get in touch with your emotional self at, you know, and BYO tissue box or something like that. You like set up expectations, and it will. So it kind of depends. It kind of depends, but it's such a big, important.
I think that's going to be Emma will have
Okay. Look, you know, and I think I've taught, sorry if I'm repeating myself now because I forget who I tell what. But when I first started, so very naughtily actually, during my training, before I had my ticket, I was in a practice giving FIs. Very bad. It was just because no one else would do, anyway, whatever. So, and I clearly didn't necessarily, and I was a physio, so I was allowed to touch people, but I was doing it in a kind of what I thought was a feldy way. I cannot tell you how many tissue boxes I went through. Like, people were crying a lot. And I didn't know what was going on. So, you know, should have told me something. And somehow or other, that very rarely happens to me now. Like, I still have my tissue box. Somehow or other, I have learnt to hold back from people tipping into a big response like that. Did you have the same, Jenny? You're nodding.
I don't buy tissue boxes very often.
Right. Yeah.
There are tissues in the room.
Yeah.
And occasionally people will shed a tear or two. But, yeah, it doesn't need to develop. It's just accepted as part of the process and we move on through it.
Yeah. So it's no big deal. Yeah.
And my theory is that it's got a lot to do with the sense of ground and safety that allows it to move on through quickly.
Yeah. You know, and I've worked with staff in training programs who I think chase down emotions big time. Like, they really put a spotlight on them in a way that Jenny and I think Ruth is the same, we don't. And Zoran, we don't. It's not that they're not in the room, but what people usually say to me is I'm very matter-of-fact about emotions. They interest me equally to any of these other things, but they're not primacy, whereas I've certainly worked with staff who really, like, it's like they're the star of the show kind of thing. And as soon as there's an emotional thing, it's like pulls focus. Well, you know, to me it's part of the system, but anyway. So... But it's important. If we come back to movement, I'll put it there and we'll come back to it. Where does movement start? So mostly it starts with some kind of sensation. If it's a really critical movement, we won't even bother the rest of the system. We'll act. We'll move. And then we'll think about it because we haven't got time to think about it because it's a pin, or it's a scorpion, or whatever it is. However, then it will come up to consciousness because we're human, and then we'll think about it, and it's a pin. Or if it's something that's pretty benign, then we might not even notice necessarily. You know, like if it's, let's say it's a pressure detector in our bum, and it's firing off because you've been sitting on your left butt cheek and it's going a bit uncomfortable, it'll come up to about here probably. So it's not a danger, but it will travel up to, up to the brainstem, where there's a whole lot of postural adjustments happening. And it will be perceived and kind of recognised and processed here. And the instruction will come back down, wriggle, get off your bum. Your butt's at risk of losing blood supply. So it's a slow-term danger. And so people with spinal cord injury who don't feel that, over time, if they don't voluntarily wriggle, like they have to remind themselves to wriggle, do pressure lifts, they're called, then they start getting tissue breakdown because they're not picking up a signal that the pressure's been going on too long and those tissues aren't getting enough blood supply. Tissue starts breaking down and it's called a pressure sore. Yep. Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's not especially conscious either, is it? So it's probably, it doesn't come up very cortical at all. It feels, if in the old language you'd say it's reflexive, it's not, because it's not sort of at this quick loop thing, but it's bubbling around in everything except for consciousness. If you see a child at risk and you know, like the mum who sees a child. I don't know, Alan used to tell this story. I don't know if it's ever really happened. That, you know, a child was caught under a car and the mum just leaps in and lifts the car off like that. You know, like does this feat of strength that if you stopped and thought about it, hear my language, stopped and thought about it, you couldn't do. But it could be a bullshit story, I don't know. But your point is that we do have these acts where we're not consciously aware and planning, but it's very sophisticated act. It's not a reflex. It's a very sophisticated, very targeted, very well orchestrated act. It doesn't have to be, let me stop and think about this. Like you're driving a car becomes relatively automatic. Yeah.
Susan, then how does someone go into shock? How does that tie in with all this, or doesn't it?
So shock is really interesting, where it shuts down a lot of things. So it's an altered consciousness where you are not perceiving correctly necessarily, and you are, depending on the nature of the shock, you might not be perceiving stimuli at all, or maybe only some. And you can actually, it's quite an autonomic state actually, like real shock. And then there's different kinds of shock. There's this kind of shock where something dramatic's happened and I'm walking around like an automaton going, you know, almost speechless. But then there's a cerebral shock where you've had lots of brain damage and you go into shock, or there's a spinal shock where your system's all shut down and all. So there's lots of different kinds of shock, but essentially it's a shutdown situation at varying levels. Yeah. So, okay, so let's go this scenario. We have a sensation. So we see that it's dark over in that corner, and so we want to go and put the light on. So that's registered the sensation. So what we do, we get that stimulus from the environment, and then we go back to the environment to look, where's the light switch? Like, what's the remedy? So first of all, we recognise the stimulus for what it is. It's dark. And then we have a judgment about we don't want it to be dark. So all of that is bubbling around through here. And it's that kind of problem-solving stuff that happens. So let's see. So we have a sensation, and then we perceive it. Now that, as I said, that could be very quickly here, like is it dangerous or not? Then here is it's sort of more of a slow burn perception, like get off your butt. Or it might need more recognition. It might need languaging, it might need naming, it might need talking. So it might be visual, but we perceive. And again, perception is what we're training in here. Actually, is perceiving the difference between effort, high effort, low effort, in between effort. We're perceiving different things. And that requires attention about what stimuli to pay attention to. So we've got all of these things being registered all of the time. Why are you all paying attention to the sound of my voice and not the sound of the air conditioner now? Yeah, you're paying attention to my voice because you're good. And if you're paying attention to the air conditioner, it wouldn't be serving you very well. So you've learned to perceive my voice as a voice and all the recognition, all the stuff. Then you're attending to it, which means you're focusing it. You're inhibiting lots of other things. Then you could spread your attention to other things. Now that I've told you about the air conditioner and my voice, you can spread your attention and you can divide it between the two. You can sustain it over time. You can do all sorts of things with your attention. Do they all ring a bell from an ATM point of view? Yep. And then you have a rest. Linda's question, why do we have rests? Because that's really hard work. So we have a rest and we don't pay attention to anything. Or we use that time to pay attention to something different or to broaden our attention or something like that. So,
It's not required in a physiological way to lay down more until you train.
So I'll say the question for the tape again. Is it physiologically required to lay down the patterns? Possibly yes. Because otherwise we just keep on, we'll overload. So it's a bit of a circuit breaker in that sense. It's a bit of a stopping of overloading. And you'll work with people who overload really quickly. You've all experienced overload. You know, it's colloquially known as I'm cooked. Can't take in anymore. And that's because your brain is trying to process too much. Shut down. So we try and come in before that in an ATM and get people to shut down. But then, of course, over time, we train them to learn to shut down when they need to. Have a rest when you need to, which could be a cognitive rest, could be anything else. Now, when the real laying down of memories occurs is actually during sleep. So there's a bit of it when we're awake in those rest periods. A lot of the consolidation going from that really, really short-term memory to longer-term memory happens when we're asleep. And that's one of the big sort of findings in the last 5 to 10 years about how important sleep is in terms of the brain reviewing what it's learnt during the day and sending some to the discard bin and others into longer-term memory. So sleep is really, 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 really important. How important is sleep? Yeah. So we do that. And then we do tap into memory about, well, have I had this situation before where I've noticed that the corner of that corner of the room is dark? Oh, yes. And I know that when that's dark, Alison and Jane over there start playing up because they're in the dark and they think that nobody can see them. I recognise, I remember that scenario before. What can I do about it? So I'm going into problem solving. I've used my memory, my history, problem solving. I've got a solution. I'm going to go and turn the light on so they're not in the dark anymore. And that's going to be good. So I go into problem solving. Sorry, just have to go into problem solving and then I make a decision. And then I weigh up the pros and cons of that problem solving. So it'll stop them misbehaving, but will then be really cross with me and they won't like me anymore. And, you know, so I go into the sort of, if I make that decision, what's the scenario for that? So I do all this thinking. I go, I'll bugger it. I'm going to go and turn the light on and expose them because they're rat bags. So I make my decision and then I go and enact it. And that's where movement starts. Even before that. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
For people who find attention difficult,
yep.
who have a deficit, does that then correlate that they're laying down of, you know, how much of a sequence is that? And if a person who has a deficiency in attention, do they then not lay down those kind of behavioural memories and then the problem solving becomes an issue? Like how
it's really
striated is that?
Yeah, so that can break down at any one of these stages. So if you've got a sensory loss, it's really hard to behave, which is Jenny's question. If you have a perceptual loss so that you can't make sense of your senses, so that would be, say, that I can't perceive the difference between a red light and a green light because I've got colour blindness, so that's a perceptual problem, that I won't know whether to stop or go at a traffic light. So that's a problem. So you can see a deficit at the perceptual level is a problem. If I have an attention problem, so I don't even know to look at the lights, so I can't sustain so, you know, the light's changing and my attention is distracted, which is what happens when you know, kids in the back going there, and you get tooted because your attention has a problem. You don't attend to the right stimulus, you fail to act. And then if you don't remember what a light means, you can't act. If you don't generate solutions like, oh, well, the light's green, but there's someone still crossing, you know, blah, blah, blah. You can't adapt to situations. So a deficit anywhere can cause a breakdown. So getting back to your question, which of these is fundamental? they're all fundamental, but this is seriously fundamental. People who can't control, manipulate their attention don't do so well in life. Yeah. Yeah. It's, you know, it's the marshalling of what you're going to, the marshalling of your awareness, if you like. So it's choosing which of these things to pay attention to notice. It's filtering as well. Experience. So a kid doesn't know which sensation to pay attention to, so it pays attention to everything, and that's why it has to sleep 20 hours a day, because it's just like, all this stuff, sound, noise, vision, taste, got to sleep. And then it gradually learns to pay attention to certain things. So we're slightly hardwired to pay attention to faces. And you could say that there's a bit of evidence about babies, they pay attention to voices, obviously, but the mum's and dad's voice more than another voice. So they can start paying attention to the mum's voice in a babble of all other voices. So it's a learned thing. That's the thing, it's a learned thing. And so if it's not well trained in us, how do we help people to learn to do it better, to pay attention better? We do it here. We do it on the floor every day. Every day.
So in some ways, this is almost full circle. If we're coming back to the kittens or children stuck in front of little screens as tots.
Yeah.
Or in a pram with I've seen little children in trolleys with, they're playing games. So, and I suppose the question is not unlike your question, is that how do they learn, and what are they learning to pay attention to? And the evidence is... But I suppose it's the same question that came about a deprived background.
Yeah.
Is the intense visual stimulation, which the brain of a screen, which the brain sees as real, because we know from virtual reality that the brain perceives the virtual experiences in the same way.
Yeah.
What is that kind of flat, two-dimensional experience giving to children in terms of attention? Because it seems to me it's very difficult to attend to one particular thing.
Yeah. This is
to have someone else define, to pinpoint where you're paying attention.
Yeah. So the evidence for this is emerging every day about this, and because my son and I love to have this argument, because he's a computer nerd, and he has a filter for looking for all the evidence about how computer activity is good for you, and I'm quite interested in the evidence that it's not good for you. So we have a lovely game about this, and we're both winning this game, and it makes sense that we are, because actually if you test kids who do a lot of screen time, actually in terms of paying attention to screen time, they're bloody geniuses. Like, their ability to sustain attention on the screen is extraordinary. Like, we can't do it. We can't sustain our attention that long. So all of these skills are trainable, and what you train is what you gain. So if you train yourself to pay attention to the screen, and you're getting a reward cycle, and it's obviously getting into an addictive cycle as well. That Eddie says, he starts pointing out my addictions, and then I have to go away and think about it. So it's getting a reward cycle, which is deep in here. They're not dumb kids. No. It's just they're super trained in one way. And what we're saying is, will that come at a cost of not being able to sustain their attention on, say, human conversation? Or will they be a danger when they go walking in the bush because they don't know how to distribute their attention across multi-modes, so multiple stimuli, in a 360 world because they're used to that. So, and the answer is we don't know. However, I mean, there's some of the data coming out about how quick these kids' reaction times are. It's amazing. And their spatial awareness is amazing in that context, not in the environmental, but the spatial awareness in terms of being able to track really quickly in the domains of where stuff are at and respond to it. So do all of this stuff in that world. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
Dark corner of the room, and then you go in, you perceive it, you go into your memories and think of a problem solving.
Yep.
So with Feldenkrais, we've asked people to pay attention and note down, might be putting in a new memory in their brain, and then they're doing a movement that draws on that memory, walking or whatever it is. Do they do that perception and then memory? Oh, I remember that Feldenkrais lesson, and it felt a bit like this. Maybe I'll do that. Is it the same process?
Yep. And possibly not conscious. Probably not conscious.
Right.
So we're bubbling it up to consciousness. That's a bit of a conceit. It's at the tip of the iceberg because a lot of the recognition, memory aspect of it is quite subconscious.
And therefore difficult to explain in a way, because it's easy to explain the dark corner of the room.
Yeah.
But the other one is a little mysterious.
Very, very hard to put in language. So I don't know if you noticed today when I was demonstrating, because I haven't demonstrated FI for a while because we haven't been doing a lot of FI, right? Because we've been concentrating on ATM. So I haven't had to demonstrate a very specific idea in FI verbally for a while, probably a year or two. And I don't know if you noticed, but I was really struggling to go verbal in an essentially very non-verbal process of when I'm pushing down through somebody's skeleton to find the floor, I could feel this wrench in my nervous system because I was so non-verbal. Now, dancers and stuff know exactly what I'm talking about. For me coming into Feldenkrais was a major challenge because I'm very verbal and very, very, very not kinesthetic. But now that I can switch and now I can feel that, how do I go from the very, I can't even do it now. I'm doing this. How do I go from the very this to the that?
Yes. And for certain people who are very, cognitive or conscious thinking, or not somatic particular, what you're saying, then it makes it harder to explain the method to them. Yeah. Mm.
So, in our training, Ruth's and my training and Zoran's, we had to do all this reading about Varela. And it was all that stuff that Zoran is getting, not Varela. Tree of Knowledge. Maturana. Varela's fine, I don't mind him. Maturana, they even brought him out to talk to us about, essentially that things don't exist if they're not in language. Well, they clearly do. They clearly do. They do. They have to. Oh. No. I must read the article. See, I shouldn't comment on articles that I haven't read, should I? But anyway. But Maturana was essentially wasn't it? Language has primacy. What's interesting is what you're saying
This is very interesting. This is what's interesting. Yeah. Well, what you're saying about that place of sensate thinking, where you're really in that experience of being in your body. See, this is what happens. Okay, so then there's that. converting that into thought,
into word,
into word is extremely difficult. And is there a sort of quantifiable, known time for that to happen? But it is physically really difficult to switch from sensation moving into verbalizing your experience of that, isn't it?
I only have an experience of the time it takes, and for me, I get better with practice again. So there's a reason why I said I haven't had to do that for a year or so, and I'm rusty. So now that we're getting into this, so in the next year and a half, I will get better at doing that again, to the point where I will give FIs and tell you what I'm feeling at the same time as I'm doing it. But I have to work back up to that. So it's trainable. That switch from one kind of modality, if you like, one modality of processing to another, that switch can get faster through practice. So that's my answer. The answer is it depends, or the pelvis, whichever you like.
All of the above.
All of the above. Jenny's got something behind you.
Oh.
Okay.
I think different people practice those transitions from one modality to another in different ways.
Yeah.
So someone who's a musician or an artist practices going from emotion to colour or to sound.
Yeah.
Poets maybe go from sensation to words all the time, some of the time. But if that's not something we're practicing, then it's a skill that can feel incredibly difficult and impossible and out of reach.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy for the exceptionals who, yes, I think, going from an emotional state and expressing that in a physical way, for me I'd just look jerky and ridiculous because I don't do it. I'd go, I'm happy. Or, and I don't mean to make dance or movement, that rigid. But the sophistication that you can traverse different modalities is really interesting.
And it's not something we're taught very much in school.
No, we're pretty mono-channel, and that's what's coming out a lot in from a neuroscience, from a learning point of view, is that we often teach in a very mono-channel way, but if you really look at human interactions, it's highly multi-channel, and we wonder then why we don't communicate very well with each other, because actually probably we're all talking about completely different things and talking in different ways and experiencing different things. But anyway, so that's a very broad overview. Now, of course, the important thing, which is where I nearly forgot it, which is kind of where my research situates, is when a movement starts with sensation, but the sensation doesn't stop when we're moving and acting. We keep sensing, because what happens is we make this decision and then we make a plan, and that plan gets sorted out. So we make a plan probably in this prefrontal area, and the plan depends on whether it's an internally derived or externally derived, but let's not worry about that. And then it zips down here to the cerebellum, and it gets kind of operationalized. So the cerebellum kind of works out, well, to walk over there, you're going to have to blah, 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 do all of these incredible computations about which muscles are going to activate and how you're going to do it. And, obviously the sequence of events. So if I'm sitting down, I have to stand up, and I have to, what walking entails, and then reaching, and like unbelievable, like billions of computations about which muscles to fire off, in what order, so what sequence, with what timing, and with what kind of strength of firing off. So it's just unbelievable, the amount of computation that has to do that, to go over there. And then, of course, now looking, there's no switch, but anyway, more problem solving. So I'll make a plan, which is effectively a simulation, again, based on my experience, and then I go ahead and then that comes, and that, so then there's a whole lot of memory stuff in here. So it comes back to memory and basal ganglia. It thinks about goals and rewards, thinks about motivation. Then it comes into the frontal lobes a bit to think about, is that appropriate or not? Like, is it actually going to be socially rude to turn the light off? So I'm going to check out this plan and all the possible sequelae, and then it's going to finally finish up in the motor cortex, which is here, where there's a nice plan already. It may be conscious by now, particularly if it's cortical conscious, and then it will scoot down and it will go to fire off all these little messages everywhere, all these muscles firing to help me to stand up, walk over there and do it. That's not the end of the story. So as I'm doing the movement, all these messages are firing off in the plan. I've got this plan, and I've sent this, I've got a copy of this plan, if you like, upstairs, and good old sensation has this plan. So I've got a plan for moving and I've got a plan for sensing. That's the trick. So not only, and this is what's fairly new to understand, is that I've got a plan for the actual output that I'm going to send to the body to do. So the output meaning what I'm going to, the instructions. But I've also got a plan, a quality assurance plan. What am I going to pay attention to as I'm doing it to make sure that it happens? So I've got a feedback plan. Who am I going to listen to tell me that things are going according to plan? Right? So I've got an inbuilt QI system all the time. And that is the other thing that we're really working with, the inbuilt quality improvement system, because we're getting better at paying attention during the movement. So this is a knowledge of performance, we would call it in sort of jargon, in a feedback loop. So with the plan, it goes to enact, and the plan comes here, and my attention will go to certain things to make sure that I'm getting it. If everything goes to plan, so I stand up and walk and it's all fine, so I go and walk over here and I've got my plan and it's all like this, and I go do that. That's not going according to plan. So immediately there's a mismatch between my plan and I sense something that I wasn't planning on sensing. Right, something touched the top of my foot in particular, and it was the mat. So my foot went under the mat. I hadn't put that into my plan. That sensation will go, oh, not right. Something's wrong. Consciousness kicks in. Well, actually, I'll react before consciousness. And I will do something. I will raise my leg, or whatever you do. You know when you walk along the footpath and you immediately do a hop, or you fall over, or you do something, you don't stop to think about that. But what's happened is the movement hasn't gone to plan. You're not feeling what you should be feeling. And so it raises the stakes and you do something different. And you have a different response. If everything goes to plan, it's all fine, and you just bubbles along and you achieve it. And then you kind of get the knowledge of results as feedback, which is the light is successfully switched off. I've got the result that I want. Then if I get the social result that these two behave themselves, everything's fine. Yeah.
What's the process if you weren't planning and you were just open to you were just moving for movement's sake, or you just, there wasn't much to it. There was just non-expecting anything could happen.
So that's improvising.
Mm.
So that's a really interesting brain state, because then you're not feeding forward. So the plan is called feed forward. I'm feeding forward, and I'm predicting what I'm going to feel. I'm feeding forward. I'm simulating what's going to happen.
Mm.
The alternative to that is to be reactive, or a nicer way is to say responsive.
Mm.
So that you have to be more attentive. You can't go, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't do impro. I think people who are really good at improvising may feel that it goes a bit more subconscious, but the awareness that you have to then be right in the moment and not have a feed forward plan, but to wait and see what the environment offers you and then respond to it. That's improvisation. And that's a really high level skill.
Mm. Is it really about like what you want to train in? Like what, you're talking about the reward system and attention, particularly being the only the conscious energy of effort that can change our patterns. But then most of the driving force is so unconscious.
Partly, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So up in here, is intention as well, and motivation, which may or may not be conscious.
Because I know that feeling that you're saying with the child just like getting really over, like just opening their attention up or whatever, and it just grabs on like
anything.
Things. Yeah, there was this one experience, and just like was driving, and I noticed like I was on the ocean road, and then I was noticing all these waves around, and I hadn't looked at the surf in ages, and I just kept like, because I was driving, and then I kept looking left as I was driving around these windy roads and just grabbing.
Yeah.
And I'd heard about this before too, about like the grasping thing and how energetically taxing it is to grasp, and how some human beings have sort of like trained their minds into like letting go of that grasping more and more, so much so that they wouldn't even need to sleep.
Oh, right. Oh, God.
Like, well, then that's on an extreme side. And, but in that sense of just interesting thought process, that if you didn't hold on to so many, because of course the environment continues and sensations continue and all of that continues anyway, that's all, it's all there, where does the movement start? I just still don't know.
Yeah.
But, where we do move and what we do, there is something in that. Yeah.
Yep. So this is all feed forward, like intentional in a way, like it could be unconscious but intentional, like you want to do it. Then there is a reactive thing in the moment, then that happens really quickly. So there's still a plan, but it's in response to not necessarily, doesn't have a clear outcome, because you're going to change the plan all the time. So my understanding from doing improvisation is that the plan is being changed in the moment all of the time. All of the time. So that's why you don't know what you're going to do next, because it's like can change in a split second. So that therefore it's in a way it's hugely demanding, isn't it?
What makes it not demanding? Like when you train
to do impro?
Yeah.
Because you're not, probably because you're not bubbling it up into really conscious thought.
So it's keeping it sort of simmered down, so you're coastering on past experience or confidence in that.
Yeah, confidence in that, and being willing to be in that situation. So for some people, being in an impro situation is a nightmare. It's a nightmare because they don't know what's going to happen next. And they don't know what's expected, and they don't have a set of responses that are available that quickly. So it's trainable, isn't it? It's trainable. You do train it.
Scary when they think it is performing, but it's actually been playing. It's about playing. So
Yeah.
when you go back to that state, you don't have the anxious about, I want to be doing well, or I want to be.
Yeah, so you have to suspend judgment and thinking judgment. Yeah. So that is a differentiation.
But you do have to have intention and attention.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The intention is to not have an outcome, which is still an intention.
Yeah. To yourself, to the environment, to the other. That's why you improvise. Yeah. Because if you have a plan, and when you do improv, and the other person's got another plan, and you don't listen to each other, you're not going anywhere. So that's why you have to be ready to change your plan again. And again.
And
if
again,
you have
again,
a plan.
and again. And maybe it's not improvisation, maybe it's responsivization.
No, it is. You're
absolutely drawing on prior experience as well, because there's still a style to it. Yeah. 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 So Julieta offered to do us something around this week. When should we do that? When would you like to do it? Thursday?
Yeah.
Or Friday afternoon?
No, it's Thursday.
Thursday. You're not in the afternoon. Do you want to start off in the morning, on Thursday morning?
It Depends of the train.
Ah, okay. We'll do it after lunch one day. We'll do it after lunch on Thursday.
Or
Remind
I can
me.
do it from 10 in the morning on Thursday. Yeah.
Okay. Is it good to do first thing in the morning? Anytime.
Oh, that's good.
All right. So we'll go offline and sort that out. Just as a little taste of what we're talking about here. Like, but it's not. It's not intentionless. It's not. Okay. So there's a few words that I've kicked around there that I won't necessarily go into, but things like goal and reward. So you think, well, how does Feldenkrais fit into that? Because we don't have a goal. Yeah, bullshit. We do have a goal. However, the goal and the reward is actually refining this process in order to do what we're going to talk about tomorrow, which is the action or the function. We just don't hang on to the goal really tightly. It's not a really clear, defined goal about, I'm going to learn to be able to play a C major scale in 2 seconds. It's not a goal like that. However, there could still be a loose goal around, using my hands more dexterously or whatever in the long term, but it's not a cause and immediate effect. There's the lesson and there's some possible effects. So it's a more diffuse goal. However, there's some very specific goals around finding out how to do the movement more easily. Very specific goal. Very, very, very specific goal, which require, all that sort of stuff. There's another word I should put down here, which is initiation. Again, thinking where things can go wrong. So I've got people who can't make plans. They've got motor planning problems. Probably they've got sensory planning problems too. And then there's problems with initiation. So someone with Parkinson's or something like that who really struggles to initiate because they're not, the goal reward stuff is related. So that actually links up to here, even though they're on other sides of the board. Yeah, they're really hard to. I always say it's a problem with the starter motor. So the motor itself is fine, the rest of the brain is fine, but firing off that initiation from a basal ganglia point of view, because their basal ganglia is dying or starved of transmitters, more to the point, they have trouble initiating. So they'll use an external cue to initiate, like a rhythmic auditory cue, or they can use a visual cue to step over lines, or they'll use some trick to get over it, but the internal reference to initiate, very difficult. So they freeze. Not freeze cold, freeze.
No, I'm sorry, I'm freezing, and I know what you're talking
about. Right. Yeah. And so dance is fantastic for them because it uses different pathways to initiate. Same as singing is different to talking. Counting is different to talking. Okay, is that enough? Quite complicated, isn't it? Quite complicated. However, hopefully, now I've used the technical language. Hopefully you can appreciate how rich the method is in terms of where we can access these, what we used to call sensory motor loops, but now we call action perception loops, or perception cognition action loops. And that it's feed forward, predicting, and then feedback during and feedback after, which is what we're doing all the time. Yep. Yep. I think you'll find your two colleagues say that life is improv. I should put over here, feed forward. And then this is feedback. Goes into the system. Feed forward is it for the plan, and then feedback. And we practice both. And it's quite a unique thing. So when we now talk about, I'll just give you a taste. So towards the end of the week, we'll start talking about body image. the current hypothesis, the clearer the body image, the better our feed forward, because we've got a clearer, what I call a little avatar to simulate things on. The clearer that is, the better we can simulate, and therefore the better the product of movement, for example. And that's the Dreyfus, not Dreyfus, whatever. No, like the thing that Feldenkrais is talking about in that article from the AY lesson 24, which is a lecture, not what's a lesson lecture, that you probably all read over the weekend.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're also working on this. It's amazing, isn't it? That's why you go home and sleep so well in a Feldenkrais segment. Okay. Yes, water in, water out, and come back in 5 minutes. That's the plan.